Today, we're diving into one of the most profound and transformative books of the 20th century, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. In this powerful memoir, Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, takes us through unimaginable challenges, teaching us how the human spirit can find purpose even in the darkest times. Moving from the oppressive horrors of concentration camps to the liberating insights of logotherapy, Frankl's journey is one of resilience, hope, and the search for meaning. In this book, Frankl doesn't focus on the well-documented atrocities of World War II. Instead, he explores the everyday lives of ordinary prisoners, who had lost everything, including their identities, and struggled daily to retain a sense of self amidst brutal conditions. These nameless prisoners, stripped of dignity and reduced to mere numbers, were often addressed simply as schmucks. They weren't heroes or martyrs, they were survivors, barely skeletons clinging to life, scraping for crumbs of bread to stave off hunger and trying to hold on to their humanity. Though psychology often demands a degree of detachment, Frankl understood that no outsider could ever fully grasp the agony of a concentration camp inmate. Only those who had lived through such horror could truly understand. Initially, Frankl considered publishing his book anonymously, not wanting readers to know him as anything beyond his prisoner number. However, he realized that sharing his identity might encourage more people to read the book, helping others to understand his message. Frankl spent nearly 3 years in the camps, not as a psychiatrist but as a prisoner. Just weeks before his liberation, he was still performing grueling labor, like laying railroad tracks and digging tunnels alone. On Christmas of 1944, he received 12 precious coupons, redeemable for either cigarettes or bowls of soup. Prisoners like him were often sold as slave labor to construction firms, with each prisoner bringing money back to the camp for their forced labor. Frankl observed the psychological journey of prisoners in 3 phases: entry into the camp, the routine of camp life, and finally, liberation. When prisoners first arrived, they were often in shock, overwhelmed by the appalling conditions. After days of cramped travel in overcrowded train cars, they trembled in fear, uncertain of what lay ahead. Through this unique perspective, Frankl's story isn't just about survival. It's about finding meaning in suffering, discovering purpose, and nurturing the strength to carry on. His insights remain deeply relevant, inspiring us to reflect on our own search for meaning in life. Join us as we explore the lessons of Viktor Frankl and how his experiences can offer us courage and clarity in our own lives. As our train pulled into Auschwitz, a place synonymous with death and gas chambers, the grim reality set in. Through the train windows, we saw watchtowers, barbed wire fences, and lines of prisoners. When the doors opened, men in striped uniforms with shaven heads known as kapos entered the carriage. These prisoners, granted slightly better living conditions for working as camp guards, sometimes behaved more brutally than the guards themselves. The train carried about 1,500 of us, and we were quickly herded off, ordered to leave our belongings behind. Men and women were separated into 2 lines, and an officer inspected each person, directing them either to the left or the right with a simple gesture that determined life or death. I soon learned the cruel truth: those directed to the left were deemed sick or unfit and sent to their deaths, while those on the right were kept alive for forced labor. When my turn came, I did everything I could to appear strong, hoping to avoid the fate that awaited those on the left. As the day wore on, I learned the chilling reality of what happened to my friend, who had been directed left. A prisoner pointed to a towering chimney and told me, "Your friend has gone to heaven from there." My friend, like countless others, had perished in the gas chambers. Those of us sent to work were stripped of everything. Guards confiscated any valuables, watches, jewelry, even personal mementos. When they ordered us to undress completely, we were left with nothing but shoes, standing in a line, shivering and exposed. After being shaved from head to toe, I could barely recognize myself in the mirror. This was just the beginning. Life at the camp settled into an unimaginable routine. Phase 2, as Frankl called it, the daily grind of despair and survival. That first night, I was crammed into an 8-foot cell with 8 other prisoners, all of us huddled close in the bitter cold. 2 blankets for 8 people became our shared luxury. In those suffocating quarters, even the most restless among us found sleep as an escape from pain. There was no brushing our teeth, no change of clothes for months, our uniforms were tattered rags, and bathing was a distant memory. Blisters from labor remained untreated. Every day, we toiled and struggled to survive, stripped of every comfort, dignity, and possession. In those desperate days, I realized the human spirit's strength and ability to endure, even when every ounce of hope seemed extinguished. Thoughts of ending our suffering by touching the electrified fences often crossed our minds. We constantly feared being taken to the gas chambers, where so many others had perished. Adding to this nightmare, the guards beat us mercilessly, often without reason. Life felt hopeless, death loomed around every corner, casting its shadow over us. One of my companions, a doctor who had arrived at Auschwitz a week before us, managed to sneak into our cell. He shared a grim survival strategy: if you want to survive, keep yourself looking fit for work. Prisoners who became too ill or lost all hope, whom the guards referred to as Musulman or Muslims, were swiftly taken to the gas chambers. In the camp, hope was as scarce as compassion, and we all began to lose our connection to life, yearning only for the homes and families we had left behind. The nightmare around us was both horrifying and revolting, yet over time, we grew numb to it. Our uniforms, if they could even be called that, were nothing more than rags tattered and filthy. Each prisoner was confined to a tiny cell, a space where we ate, slept, and even relieved ourselves. Entering another cell without permission invited punishment. Life here was a grim parody of existence, where new arrivals faced unimaginable hardship, often forced to clean the latrines with no option to refuse. If they resisted, they were humiliated or beaten. Punishment parades were common. Prisoners were forced to march around the camp for hours, beaten along the way. A 12-year-old boy was once punished by being made to stand barefoot in the snow until his feet were frostbitten and gangrenous. The daily suffering and death around us became so normalized that it barely registered. We felt no pain, no sorrow, no pity. In our shock, we had lost our connection to human emotions, replaced by an emptiness that numbed our souls. Once, I found myself among prisoners infected with typhus. Their condition was dire. Fevers raged, and they trembled uncontrollably. Many died right before my eyes, and each death sparked a frenzy as others scrambled to strip the body of shoes, coats, or food. Just hours earlier, I had spoken with a man who lay dead now, his body looted as I sipped my thin soup in silence. We were at the mercy of the guards, who beat us whenever they pleased. One day, as I labored on the railway tracks during a fierce snowstorm, I crouched down briefly to rest. A guard saw me and, without warning, hurled a stone at me. Life in the camp was a test of endurance, stripped of every human decency, where we clung to survival, and nothing else. That day, I felt less than human, as if I were just an animal driven to work. I'd been hit twice on the head simply because the prisoner behind me hadn't walked in line. The physical pain wasn't as piercing as the humiliation, as the beating seemed designed to strip away the last remnants of our dignity. These frequent, senseless attacks were slowly suffocating our self-respect, reducing us to mere beasts. Due to the grueling workload, many of us developed edema, our hands and feet were painfully swollen, and our skin had hardened so much that bending our knees was an ordeal. Our feet had become so large that shoes barely fit anymore. Yet, going barefoot was out of the question, especially since we were forced to march and work in the freezing snow. Often, as we trudged along the icy paths, one prisoner would slip, and the rest of us would stumble on top, only to be struck by the guard's rifle butt in a barrage of blows. The guards frequently compared us to regular laborers, scoffing that we were lazy and inefficient. But were those workers forced to survive on scraps of bread and thin soup? Did they ache for their families and homes, or endure constant beatings? Despair became our shield. Every day, we told ourselves, one more day survived. Our thoughts narrowed to just survival, clinging to the next meager meal and a sip of water. In our darkest moments, all we could dream about was bread, a piece of cake, and a warm bath. While working, we'd quietly share memories of our favorite dishes, swap recipes, and even plan reunions for the day we would be free. We longed for a future where we could sit at a table again with our families, savoring a joyful meal. But that dream was light years away from our bleak reality. Our diet was wholly inadequate for the intense labor we performed, especially in our tattered clothes. A diet of thin soup and stale breadcrumbs offered little sustenance, but occasionally, we'd receive small luxuries like cheese, margarine, or watery jam, though even these were rare. When our body's fat stores dwindled, it started consuming muscle, each of us gradually wasting away into a skeleton of our former selves. With no external protein, the body turned on itself. We could almost predict who would succumb next to starvation. Each night, I'd lie in my cell and think, what was I, and what have I become? Each day began well before sunrise, with 3 sharp whistles that jolted us awake. Groggy and aching, we'd force our swollen feet into wet shoes and stumble to our feet, marching unsteadily through the snow. Digging railway tracks, we lived for the moment the siren signaled lunchtime. Between 9:30 and 10 o'clock, we were given our ration, the most vital part of the day. Some prisoners devoured their meals in seconds, but I tried to save part of my food in my pocket, savoring it over time to make it last just a bit longer. Slowly, arrangements were made for my transfer from AIDS to the DHA concentration camp. DHA held about 2,000 prisoners, and our train traveled through Vienna, the city I once called home. 50 of us were crammed into a windowless prison car, with some sitting on the floor while others stood. 2 large holes in the walls allowed glimpses of the outside, and as the tracks neared my homeland, a longing to see my house, even just for a moment, filled me. I pleaded with others to let me reach one of those holes, but my request fell on indifferent ears. One prisoner even mocked me, saying, "You've been here long enough, you must have seen it well by now." From the harsh winter of 1945 to the early days of spring, the camp at Aitz was ravaged by a typhus outbreak, claiming the lives of many prisoners. With no medicine or doctors, those infected were quarantined. I, too, caught the illness, but I kept myself from surrendering to it. I avoided sleep, staying awake by mentally crafting lectures. Though all my manuscripts had been confiscated when I entered the camp, I still found scraps of paper to jot down ideas, clinging to the belief that even if a prisoner's body and mind are broken, their spirit can endure. It's a common misconception that survivors were physically strong. In reality, it was often those with resilient spirits who survived. Faith became a force that kept us alive. After long days of grueling work, some of us would gather to pray in silence, nurturing a belief that justice would prevail in the end. Intellectuals and sensitive thinkers, ironically, could withstand the isolation and despair by finding solace deep within themselves. Even as their bodies suffered, their spirits soared, finding freedom in small, private acts of hope. When everything is taken from you, your family, your work, your happiness, even your very identity, where can you find meaning? In a place where death hovers like a constant shadow, when there's no visible hope, what's left to live for? Many prisoners faced this dilemma daily, wondering if survival was worth it or if it was better to simply let go. As a psychiatrist, I had an instinct to observe others closely, and I started to understand the depth of our psychological battles. In this daily struggle against hunger, oppression, and death, I realized that what sustained us wasn't physical resilience alone, it was the glimmers of love and beauty, memories of loved ones, nature, and life beyond the fences that gave us reasons to continue. Sitting in my cell, I began to see that our spirit's capacity to create meaning, even in suffering, was something that could never be stripped from us. While writing this manuscript, I sometimes found myself counseling fellow prisoners. Despite our dire circumstances, we all clung to a fragile hope, dreaming of a day when we might be free once more. We imagined starting over, returning to a life filled with purpose. After all, as long as we were alive, there was still hope. One early morning, we set out for work, the guard barking, "Squad, move forward left, 234. Anyone who fell behind was kicked without hesitation. We stumbled through the darkness, tripping over stones and splashing into puddles. Suddenly, the man walking ahead of me whispered, "What if our wives saw us like this? It's better they don't know." His words struck me deeply, and I began to think of my own wife. Looking up at the sky, I imagined her face, and as dawn began to break, her smile seemed to radiate across the horizon. In that moment, I felt a profound understanding of the meaning behind love-filled poems and songs. It was as though love itself offered a kind of salvation. Despite having nothing in this bleak place, the memory of my beloved wife brought me an indescribable joy. As we marched forward, I began speaking to her in my thoughts, asking her questions, and imagining her answers. Around me, prisoners stumbled and were whipped by guards, but I was lost in this inner conversation. When we finally arrived at the work site, everyone hurried to grab tools, while I remained absorbed in thoughts of my wife. I didn't even know if she was still alive, but her memory alone was enough to sustain me. Her love filled my soul, keeping her close, regardless of time or distance. This was the essence of logotherapy, the idea that we must find meaning in our lives, no matter the circumstances. For a prisoner, it became essential to search for a purpose beyond survival, even after liberation. It meant finding a reason to live, whether one's loved ones were still alive or not, or whether one's home was gone. We had to redefine our existence. During one journey from Ates to Dao, we glimpsed nature through the sealed windows of the train, the lush, green mountains, the sun cutting through clouds, the sky shifting from blue to red. The beauty of it all was overwhelming. It was as if nature itself was a reminder of life's resilience, a balm to our suffering. One of my companions, filled with awe, whispered, "This world is so beautiful." Phase 3, Liberation. In the final days, even the sick prisoners were shown a small mercy, a faint indication that freedom was near. But for us, true liberation would not only be freedom from the camp, it would be a journey to rediscover meaning and rebuild life, no matter what we had lost. In their last days in the camp, the sick prisoners were granted a small mercy. They were allowed to lie down in their bunks all day without working. But the mercy was limited. They received only poor-quality food and no medicine. A doctor requested my help in treating typhus patients, and I was sent to a sick ward in Bavaria, where I was responsible for a cell of 50 patients. These men burned with fever, lost in delirium. I fetched medical supplies daily, but these supplies were sparse, just 10 fever pills. Only the sickest were given a half dose of aspirin. There was no medication for those beyond saving. I would check each man's pulse, then retreat to a corner where I could see the Bavarian landscape beyond the grim scene around me. I'd lose myself for moments gazing out, as the conditions within the camp worsened daily. Some prisoners had turned to cannibalism out of starvation. It felt as though we stood at the very edge of a battlefield. During this period, a fellow inmate and I plotted an escape. A contact was supposed to meet us with forged documents and uniforms, our path to freedom. But as I returned to my cell to gather a few belongings, my toothbrush, eating utensils, and tattered gloves, regret filled me. How could I leave my sick companions behind? I resolved to make one last round through the ward to check on them. One patient, sensing I might leave, looked up at me and asked, "Are you leaving too?" The pain and despair in his eyes weighed heavily on me. I told my companion that I couldn't go through with the escape. My final day in the camp came when the front lines of battle reached us. Guards and capos fled as the camp was to be burned that evening. The prisoners, except for the feverish and unconscious sick, were evacuated en masse. As I prepared to leave, a large Red Cross car drove into the camp, bearing a white flag. A team from the International Red Cross emerged, assuring us that we were now safe. They distributed medicine and cigarettes and began evacuating the camp. My companion and I chose to stay behind with the typhus patients. That night, doctors ran through the camp, urging everyone to cover themselves as gunshots and cannon blasts echoed around us. We lay on the battlefield itself. But at dawn, as the fighting suddenly ceased, a white flag was raised outside the camp. At that moment, my journey as prisoner number 1114 ended. And so concludes the summary of man's search for meaning. Viktor Frankl's story is a powerful reminder, even in the darkest of times, we can find purpose. If this summary resonated with you, consider reading the full book for a deeper understanding of his experiences and philosophy. Don't forget to subscribe for more enriching summaries to help you unlock your potential. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.